Welcome to Love Factually, the podcast that analyzes rom-coms and romantic films using the science of close relationships. We're your hosts, Paul Eastwick and Eli Finkel. Eli, what are we talking about today?
Today we are talking about Clueless, Amy Heckerling's 1995 high school melodrama starring Alicia Silverstone and featuring Paul Rudd in his film debut. Some of the key themes we'll explore are whether similarity promotes attraction, how matchmaking works, and whether we all agree on who's hot.
And fair warning, we'll be spoiling this movie today. So if you don't want to know whether a near-death experience can help you lose your virginity, then go watch the movie and then come back. Okay, so Eli, kick it off by telling us who are the key characters and couples in this movie.
The protagonist is Cher. She is played by Alicia Silverstone. She ends up with Josh, her erstwhile stepbrother, who is played by Paul Rudd. And then Cher's friend Dion is dating a guy named Murray. The actor is best known for playing Dr. Chris Turk on Scrubs.
Yep, that's how I know him.
Yeah. And then Cher tries to set up her new friend Ty with a popular douchebag, but Ty ends up with Travis Birkenstock, a lovable burnout. A less fun aside, Ty is played by Brittany Murphy. May she rest in peace.
Yeah.
And then finally, the fourth significant couple is Mr. Hall and Miss Geist. They are socially hopeless middle-aged teachers for whom Cher successfully plays matchmaker. Worthy note, Mr. Hall is played by the inconceivable guy from The Princess Bride. So those are the chess pieces.
Yeah.
Paul, are you ready to deliver a 1-minute summary of how the plot moves those pieces across the chessboard?
That is right. Time me. And I got a couple other guys that are going to make a brief appearance in the plot summary here. Okay, ready?
I'm excited to hear.
Okay,
all right.
hit me.
On your mark. Get set. Go.
All right. So the three acts of this movie more or less track how Cher is relating to three different men. First is Elton, and then Christian, and then finally Josh. So to begin, Cher and her best friend Dion, they do a little matchmaking between Mr. Hall and Miss Geist, and then they adopt a new girl, Ty, into their clique and make her into an air quotes hot popular girl. Okay, Cher does her best to set Ty up with Elton, but it turns out Elton has a thing for Cher and is also a piece of shit. So in part two, Cher works on attracting a new guy, Christian, and that seems to be going well until it turns out that Christian isn't air quotes available. That's okay. He ends up being a good friend. Okay, finally, third section, Ty becomes interested in Josh. This confession sends Cher into a tailspin as she realizes she is in fact in love with Josh. Cher wins Josh over. Feelings are confessed. Ty ends up with skater boy Travis, who honestly she should have been with all along. And pretty much everything I've just said is also in the Jane Austen novel Emma, from which this movie is adapted.
Whoa, 59.26 seconds.
Yes,
well done.
Yes. Okay, so Eli, tell me about your relationship to this movie. I don't know, like maybe this was huge for you in high school. I don't know.
You know, I don't remember it from back then. I mean, I've sort of always been aware of it, but I don't remember the first time I saw it. And I actually hadn't seen it many times before I watched it a couple times in advance of this conversation. You know, what the movie stood out to me for sort of an idiosyncratic reason. And in particular, it had to do with this, you know, idea that Cher is trying to turn Ty basically into Cher's own creation. Cher has a vision for what Ty should be and then tries to make her that way. And you may be familiar with George Bernard Shaw's Pygmalion, over a century-old play at this point. But the plot there is, you know, a guy named a linguist named Henry Higgins decides it would be fun to turn Eliza Doolittle, an impoverished and Cockney-speaking flower girl, into a highborn lady. So he's going to teach her for his own amusement how to speak well and how to act well. And he says to his mother, "You have no idea how frightfully interesting it is to take a human being and change her into a quite different human being." Yikes. And the reason why this was so relevant for me is I was in that film. Well, I wasn't in the film. I was in the play.
You were in Pygmalion?
I was in 1964 film. So the play was from 1956, and the musical based on this was My Fair Lady, and I was in that, and I was Colonel Pickering, the guy who places a bet. Places a bet
Colonel
with
Pickering?
with Higgins, and so my view is like, no way, you'll never succeed in passing her off as like a highborn, you know, basically princess. And so what was interesting to me is like, I thought, well, haven't we always known that it was like a really bad idea to try to create people into some image just for our own entertainment. And of course, that's what Cher tries to do. That's what Emma tried to do in the original novel from Jane Austen. And it seemed like a bad idea at the time. And I have not seen anything that dissuaded me from that view.
So you're basically the Dion character. You're basically sort of playing second in command.
I am
Dion. That's unbelievable. Yeah,
that's right.
I have never experienced the events of this film personally, and this really wasn't in my personal canon until fairly recently. But I guess, this movie is spoofing a time that I remember very well. And I think what's impressive about this movie is how much it's satirical, right? But it's not mean. And especially when you're satirizing, the time that is currently happening, I think that's hard to do all of those things in combination, right? It's pretty affectionate toward its characters,
right.
and I really like that
characters.
about it. Yeah, she really does.
It's interesting. I think when Jane Austen was writing Emma, of course, 1815 publication,
over 200 years ago.
Yeah, 200 years ago. And again, this movie's it's modern, but it is a pretty precise spiritual connection to the original. But when Jane Austen was writing Emma, she wrote to a friend and said, "I have a protagonist, and I think I'm the only one who will like her." And you do get that sense. Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, that's exactly. And that's kind of how this comes across. Except I think in the end, we all kind of love Cher. Okay.
Yeah, in the end.
So I think this movie gets a lot of things right when it comes to the science of close relationships. Although it's also funny how what it gets right starts to blend into what it gets wrong too. So
interesting.
Let's start with mate value.
Yep.
A lot of this movie is premised on the idea that there is a hierarchy of desirability, right? A pecking order, if you will, especially in this high school context. And some people are more desirable than others. And Cher goes around presuming that she can see matches often in the form of equivalent desirability.
Yeah, for sure. That's what she's doing.
Yeah. And part of the reason she takes on Ty as a project is because she thinks this is a girl I can make hotter and then set her up with one of the very few acceptable boys at this school.
Right, because she otherwise would be in danger of getting somebody who is beneath what she should actually have.
Right. So I am willing to, at least at first, put this into what the movie gets right category. So, Eli, you may have heard of something called the social relations model. Have you heard of this?
I am a true admirer of Dave Kenny's brilliant work.
Okay, very good. And a lot of these effect sizes, I've gotten help from Dave Kenny talking about these things. So I swear to God, I'm not full of shit as I'm talking about these numbers. Okay, so what the social relations model does is it takes any judgment, like I think this person is hot, and it divides it into three pieces. The three pieces are how I see the world. I'm the person making the hotness judgment. Okay, so maybe I think everybody's hot. That's sometimes called the perceiver effect. There's the target effect. That is, well, everybody agrees this person is hot. Okay. And then there's also a relationship effect. Do I think you are especially hot above and beyond those first two components? Mm-hmm. So this second one, the target effect, this is the one that's really key to Cher's worldview, right? Because if that second component is really powerful, what it means is that people agree about who's desirable and who's not, right? Like some people are 10s and some people are 3s.
Right.
So in the science, they call this mate value. But the social relations model helpfully points out that, hey, this is just one of three components that explains why we think someone is hot and someone is not, right? So it's unlikely that agreement is going to be perfect. So is Cher right that mate value is a thing, that we agree that some people are 10s and some people are 3s? Well, when people first meet, we can put some numbers on this. So imagine, Eli, that you and I were at a high school and we had to make some call about whether this new guy was hot.
Okay.
What percentage of the time do you think we would agree? We're just rating hot or not. New guy arrives. What are the odds we agree?
So both on the same side of the coin flip.
Yeah, exactly.
I think you and I would agree about 75 to 80% of the time about whether somebody is or is not hot based on a first look.
Right. I think that's close to what most people would predict. The actual answer is lower. It's 63% of the time.
Interesting.
Yeah. Now that is greater than 50-50.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it is meaningfully larger than 50-50, although, yeah, we'd be disagreeing plenty of the time, too.
Yeah.
Importantly, the extent to which we agree that 63% is going to go down precipitously as people get to know each other. So after weeks pass, it's actually going to become like 58% agreement. And then if it's people who've known each other for a long time, it's getting closer to 53%. Now, that is barely better than
basically a coin flip.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think this movie, it's working with the idea that there's made value at initial acquaintance. And that's part of how Cher sees the world. And she's not wrong, at least when Ty has just arrived and people don't know her yet. But I think where this issue is going to start to blend into what the movie gets wrong is that Cher's pretty overconfident that her perceptions are the correct ones.
Oh, yeah.
Really, there's like no awareness of this idea that agreement about whether Ty is desirable or that the popular guys are desirable is going to go down with time.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things I've wondered, I'm familiar with the research you're talking about, and I've wondered, like, wasn't the opposite prediction also plausible? So as I understand the evidence, and again, this is evidence from you and Lucy Hunt, I believe, it's that early on, we have some amount of agreement about who's really appealing, but then as we get to know people better, there's less consensus about who's appealing. Right. Wouldn't the other hypothesis have been plausible in advance, that as we get to know better, we discover who's actually appealing? Why do you think that isn't what happened?
It's totally fascinating. So for a long time, people thought that was how it worked when it came to like learning about somebody's personality traits. This work goes back several decades. But what it turns out is that agreement stays pretty steady over time when it comes to somebody's, is this person extroverted or not, right? Mm-hmm. So observers initially agree that somebody is extroverted. And then as you get to know people, that same level of agreement is there. It's far from perfect, but, there's certainly agreement there. And the reason why, according to Dave Kenny, the gospel known as Dave Kenny, initially people are kind of drawing based on stereotypes, small snippets, thin slices of information that have some value to it. And also are misleading too. But again, if everybody's using the same wrong information, they'll agree.
Right.
Okay? And then those stereotypes gradually get replaced with ground truth. Mm-hmm. So that's why it doesn't really shift, right? But it's made up of, it has a different composition, whether it's early or later, but consensus stays the same. And so the argument that we've made is that when it comes to things like who's desirable and who's not, ground truth over time largely is illusory. Some people are desirable at first, but over time, compatibility, that relationship component, starts to matter a whole lot more.
I would love to keep chatting with you about this, mainly because I find it to be such an optimistic perspective on love. Like, one is like, well, I don't know, it's like tens, and if you're a 3, well, sucks to be you. And the other's like, no, you're probably a 10 for somebody. That's very the idea. Appealing possibility. Yeah. I have a couple things too. I'll toss one out here. So one of the ideas in this movie is that reciprocity matters. That is, if we learn that somebody likes us, that will increase the odds that we like them. And it's not clear to me whether that is, one of the core ideas in the movie or just one of the core ideas in Cher's own head. But she keeps trying to set people up, including like Mr. Hall and Miss Geist. And when she does it, the primary strategy she uses is to say, well, I hear Miss Geist likes you, or actually, I think I wrote this down. So
you're the only one with any intelligence.
Yeah, that's right. Miss Geist was right about you. You're the only one with any intelligence. And he's like, well, there's somebody with judgment. And so he does, in fact, develop the hots for her and vice versa. Develops the hots for Miss Geist, thank goodness, not for Cher. And that they do end up together. Now, I will say that Cher tries something similar with Elton and Ty, and that doesn't go well. So it's not that thinking somebody is into you is sufficient to overcome the fact that one of these people is a total douchebag. But it is in fact a strong predictor of whether we like somebody, and in particular, learning that they uniquely like us, not learning like, well,
Right.
there's somebody who likes a lot of people, including you. That tends not to be very hot in the research literature.
Yeah.
But we've seen, and certainly some of this research goes back into the 70s, finding out that somebody has judgment and doesn't really dig everybody, but there's something about you that is in fact very, very hot.
That's right. And she says you're the only one here with any intelligence,
Only
right?
one.
It really is making it that unique component.
Yeah.
I will say there are some other things that Cher does with respect to reciprocity and her matchmaking that I think would not have gone as well. But that's the one that I think she got right.
The one where she says, you're the only one at this school.
Yeah. You are the one that appeals to her. Yep, there it is.
Talk to me. Anything else that you saw in there that you thought we should give credit to the movie for, what the movie gets right about the science of relationships?
I think the movie sort of makes this point as an aside, but it'll end up being important when we talk about similarity a little more, is that the movie makes it clear that even within this school, which is clearly extremely wealthy, there are still groups, right? These groups of different kinds of kids who sort based on their interests, maybe a little bit based on their personality. And that this is the idea that similarity works through a process called niche construction, right? So you have interests, you have values, you like being around certain kinds of people, and you will choose to be around those people. And then if you end up dating people that you meet, it will often come from that same pool. Okay. So I just think that's important context for thinking about, why do romantic partners end up being similar to each other? Similarity must promote attraction. It's important to keep in mind that many times that similarity is happening way upstream of when any particular romantic choices are happening.
Yeah, I mean, the major objection that Cher has to Ty being attracted to Travis is that he's like a burnout. He's not one of the popular kids, and therefore is not within the category of people to be taken seriously as a potential partner.
Right. Exactly.
Before we move on to some, misconceptions in the movie, I should give credit for one other thing that you referenced earlier when you were first chatting about what we were talking about today, which is this idea of misattribution of arousal.
Oh, yeah.
And
sure. That's great.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's perfect how it handles this. In fact, this is a clip that I think both of us show in our own classes.
Yeah.
So the clip the part that you were talking about earlier is Dion is learning how to drive, and her boyfriend is in the passenger seat and is trying to help her learn how to drive, and things go very, very badly. And she inadvertently gets on the freeway, and then there's a massive, massive 18-wheeler right behind them, like literally just a few feet behind, and blaring on the horn, and she is freaking out. And then eventually they find a safe spot.
Oh, there it is. All right, we're off. Damn, you did wonderful. It's all right, baby. Relax. Honey, relax. Baby, relax. Breathe in, breathe. Let it out. Breathe, honey, breathe. Relax.
Boy, getting off the freeway makes you realize how important love is. After that, Dion's virginity went from technical to non-existent.
Yeah. And it's a fun play on that idea that these sorts of, scary or near-death experiences can increase attraction. And, this is a research literature that goes back 50 years. The classic study was in British Columbia in the early 1970s, where they is sort of an intriguing study. They studied men who were crossing either a really high, rickety, scary bridge, or men that were crossing a very low, stable bridge that was just a few feet above the water. And the study had a woman, a female research assistant, ask him, do a quick interview with these men as they crossed over the bridge. And it included she asked the men to tell a story, and then later the researchers coded for sexual and romantic imagery in the story. And then she said something to the effect of, well, I don't have the results here, but here's my phone number if you'd like to learn more about the study. And across all the various measures they had, what they found is that men who had crossed the high rickety bridge were more sexual in the content that they expressed to her, and then also more likely to call her, quote unquote, to hear about the study. And then you might think there's problems with that design. Maybe it's like really bold, assertive, sexualized men are more likely to use the high bridges. But at this point, there's a lot of rigorously controlled laboratory experiments that show that when people are physiologically aroused, that is, their heart rate is up and so forth, and then they encounter somebody who's a little bit attractive, they tend to think that person is more attractive than they would otherwise because they're experiencing that physiological arousal.
Yeah, that's right. But I think we want to be clear, like, you should not actually drive like anybody actually drives in this movie, with the exception of Paul Rudd. Like,
that's right. That's right. Paul Rudd is a reasonable man, and the rest of them are chaos inducers.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely dangerous.
Yeah.
All right. Talk to me about what this movie gets wrong.
Mate preferences. Here, I know that I'm speaking your language. I don't know if you flagged this one as well, but there's that scene where Ty and Dion and Cher are in a restaurant, and an attractive male waiter walks past. Cher checks him out and says, "Survey says," and Ty says, "Doable," which I sort of remember from the 90s. That was actually the way we talked about people, I think. It's kind of weird. And then Dion says, "Puny, I like him big," and Cher says, "Ew, I hate muscles." And so one of the things that's interesting is these people, certainly Dion and Cher, think they have real stable preferences. That Dion thinks, like, I'm going to like the
very
muscular guys.
Specific things.
Very specific, yes. And Cher
specific.
thinks, like, no, I sort of like the skinnier guys. And it's an open question whether over time they will actually end up more attracted to men who have those attributes versus not.
That's right. I think when you take single attributes like that in isolation, the extent to which you can expect their, I think we're hearing their stated preferences in that moment. I believe them when they say, like, that guy is doable or that guy's not doable. Sure. Those are judgments that people can make. But when it comes to the abstractions or the extrapolations to, I don't like muscular guys or I don't like puny guys, right? The odds that stated preference is going to correlate with somebody's revealed preference, what they would actually prefer across a whole set of potential men they might want to date. It will, it might be greater than zero, but it's going to be really, really, really small. You'll not be able to see it with the naked eye.
This is something that the last 20 years of research has really convinced me of, that I did not know in advance. It's one of the things that I think is really valuable about collecting evidence. I would have just had the assumption that, look, people say they like muscular guys or they like skinny guys, and they just do. And that if you track them over time, that the people who like the muscular guys are going to be more attracted to the men whom they meet who are muscular than the women who say, I don't like muscular guys. But those effects tend to be absolutely tiny, mainly because people are so vastly more complicated than any given attribute in isolation. And so the ability to apply, is this person muscular or not? I mean, people could do that in principle. That's just not how the attraction system works. You end up attracted to the individual as a whole rather than to some collection of independent features.
That's right. That's right. For me, I think the thing that stands out the most that the movie gets wrong, and I think there's a case to be made. The movie knows the movie knows what it's playing with here, but this idea that the way to a stable relationship is through the process of becoming more desirable, right? The idea of desirability as a project, and you improve your standing in the mating market, and that is how you do better. So that is clearly the assumption that Cher and Dion come to, and that, Ty goes along with, right? That idea, I think, it really rests on the mate value consensus stuff we talked about a few minutes ago, that at initial acquaintance, people do agree. But what it misses is that consensus declines over time. And it also misses that the lion's share of the variance, the lion's share of what is important when it comes to who you find desirable, what you find hot, is idiosyncratic. It's in that relationship effect component, right?
So interesting.
That there's far more disagreement because somebody just uniquely appeals to you in a way that they wouldn't appeal to me or that they wouldn't appeal to somebody else. And so when we think about mating as this competitive marketplace, that actually forces people to be operating in a set of mating dynamics that's really good for some people and not great for other people.
Right.
But honestly, that's not the way it really works once people are out there in the world, and especially once they're interacting with each other over time.
That's so fascinating, especially because of how not intuitive it is. So let's say there's somebody out there listening who thinks, are you joking? Like, do you really think that if I could drop 20 pounds, or if I were 4 inches taller, or if I had a better car, whatever it is, that I wouldn't be more appealing? It's not that you believe the very strongest version that like those things don't make a difference, right?
Right. Exactly. These things do make a difference. Basic like health and hygiene sorts of stuff are always going to be a good idea. But the majority of why we find some people appealing versus not has to do with the unique connections we have with other people. And sometimes I'll just refer to that as compatibility, right? I mean, we understand that concept. We understand the idea that like, that's my friend's girlfriend. And like, I think my friend's awesome and she seems all right, but I wouldn't want to date her. But that's not any kind of judgment about core desirability or anything like that. And that is how it works most of the time.
So do I have it right that there's a little bit of a sequence thing here, that sure, like people who are like really fit looking and healthy looking more generally, they really do better, like by consensus. That is, more people will be interested in them rather than people who are less fit and less healthy looking, let's say. But that's really something that fades, that preference for the person who's objectively fitter is more ephemeral. And really, once you get to know people, sure, maybe it still matters a tiny bit after you've known people 6 months, but very, very little, especially relative to the fact that's like, we laugh a lot when we're together.
That's right. Here's a great example that I'll describe concisely here, but this is from a data set that tracks people's crushes over time. So you might be romantically interested in, several different people, more or less, over a period of several months. And what was also a part of this data set were coders' ratings of the attractiveness of the crushes themselves, right? So if you're a participant in this study, Eli, those are ratings of the person you might be interested in. And it turns out that after just a few weeks passing of you being, into some of these women, not so into others, that those coder ratings of the women's attractiveness had nothing to do with how much you were into them. After just a few weeks, the correlation was 0.03. Right? So it doesn't take long once things start unfolding. Once you get into the will they or won't they component of it, attractiveness really stops mattering and it all becomes those idiosyncratic judgments.
That's fascinating. So it's like, okay, when you're swiping, maybe these things matter. On a first glance across a bar, maybe these things matter. But like once you've been in a class together for, 6 weeks, these things become almost irrelevant.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
What else you got here?
Well, I mentioned earlier this idea of Pygmalion, the idea that we often try to sculpt people. I don't know if I would say we often. Certainly Cher is trying to sculpt people. Emma from the initial book is trying to sculpt people, right? Sort of for their own entertainment value. But there is an alternative form of sculpting, which my advisor Carol Rusbolt has studied, and I've studied myself, which is this idea of the Michelangelo effect.
Sure.
Right?
Tell us about that.
And the major difference here is both of these are situations in which I might contribute to somebody else's development over time, to changing somebody else. The real difference here is, am I changing them in accord with my own vision, that we could call the Pygmalion effect or the Cher effect, or am I changing them in a way that's consistent with their vision? Right.
That's interesting.
Yeah. The metaphor for the Michelangelo effect is, as you well know at this point, is that all of us have these sort of unsculpted versions of ourselves, that is like our actual self. But then, metaphorically within us, we've got the ideal version of ourselves, the hidden David inside us. And so the question is, are our relationship partners changing us in ways that make them more like the person they want us to be, or helping us in a way that makes us more like the person we ourselves want to be?
Yeah, right.
And the Michelangelo effect is generally beneficial for relationship well-being, in contrast to the Pygmalion.
And you could argue that if Cher knew about the Michelangelo phenomenon, she would have realized from the beginning of the movie that Ty was, trying to, that her interests were more closely aligned with Travis's, right? I mean, she was, clearly interested in drugs from the beginning and interested in hanging out with
Coke
that
here.
group. Yeah, right. I know. I love that. God, I love that.
Yeah.
You guys got Coke.
What did she say? She needed an herbal remedy.
Yeah, right. An herbal remedy, exactly.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think Cher, again, I think that's a great observation, is she is much more in the Pygmalion, I'm going to make you what I think you need to be, rather than the Michelangelo, let me help you find, your interests, your values, but become who you want to be.
Yep. How about you? Anything else that the movie is a misconception about how relationships work?
I mean, one thing I think is interesting about this movie is how it takes those cliques from high school and layers it on top of what in Emma was social class, right?
Yeah, that's a great point.
So Emma, these characters are operating within these different realms of social class, and you don't want to date down in the market, right? And so again, Cher in the movie is kind of layering that on top. But I'm a big fan of this paper that came out a couple years ago. That have you watched Bridgerton at all? Are you a Bridgerton guy?
I haven't.
Okay.
I think I saw it a little bit when my wife was watching it, but I don't really know the characters.
Okay. Well, I won't get into the characters, but there's something called The Season. Okay. So The Season is when Queen Victoria hosts all these balls, and it's a chance for the, children of aristocrats to meet each other, fall in love, and get married. And it was a thing in real life, and it worked for a long time. Until the 1860s, what happened was that Queen Victoria took a few years off of hosting the balls. And what happened was that the aristocrats' kids still wanted to get married, and so they went out and they met more commoners. And guess what? They married the commoners because they're meeting and they're discovering compatibility and they're finding the idiosyncrasies, and they marry the commoners. And in a generation, you have more distribution of wealth throughout Britain.
How cool is that?
Yeah,
the natural experiment in the highest order.
Exactly. Yeah. So, the parallel works, especially in the sense that it highlights how unhelpful it is to think about some sort of true value hierarchy the way there might be in animals. Yeah, social class is a thing, and we use it to keep people separated from each other. But the extent to which it's really related to attraction in relationships is kind of suspect once people actually get to meet.
You're right. One of the things that really worked about Clueless is, Amy Heckerling's insight that popularity at elite high schools, it's kind of like, being, the social class circumstances in early 19th century England. It does basically work.
Yeah, totally. All right. So I wonder if you have some things you're wondering if we're okay with in this movie.
Right. Yes. It is always interesting to revisit these things. I had a couple of things that I don't know. I don't want to say stuck in my craw, but raised questions for me. To some degree, we sort of have to let some of the stuff go. Like if we're going to watch 80s and 90s films, I mean, they all have stuff that a lot of us today would look back on and be like,
I winced more than once.
I winced more. Yeah. I mean, and this one is not as bad as some, but let me put a few things in that bucket. And then I actually have a bigger bucket. So the like, oh God, it's an 80s and 90s film bucket. So it traffics in stereotypes about sexual orientation, and has a lot of like crass language about it. And of course, the gay guy Christian is like super fashionable, and it trivializes unwanted sexual attention. So there's this party game they have literally called Suck and Blow, but it's far less hot than that might make it seem. They take a playing card and they like sort of put it next to their mouth, and then they can suck on it and keep it there, and then they just turn to the person next to them, and then that person sucks the card off the first person's face.
It's extremely confusing.
It's extremely the procedure is straightforward. Why they think it's fun is confusing.
Right.
and then at one point, the douchebag who's into Cher, he, he like the card fell off his face, and he basically like gives her a big wet kiss, and she's grossed out by it, but it's basically played for laughs.
Yeah, right.
And more generally, like serious social issues, they're largely absent from the film. Like they live in this sort of fantasia. But then there's like even when things come up, like there's a debate in class where Cher is trying to argue that the U.S. should take in more people from Haiti due to the dire circumstances and poverty there. And it's funny because she doesn't pronounce Haitians correctly; they're Haitians, and she gives some.
Apparently, that was
speech.
true. She actually didn't know how to pronounce it.
Oh,
Alicia Silverstone. And they're like, keep it rolling.
Keep it rolling. I did not know that. That's funny. And anyway, she gives some thing like, well, America, we should have the resources to do this because like one time I held a dinner party and people came over who didn't RSVP. And in a way, it's kind of a touching speech about like, we have the resources if we want it, but it's certainly like, basically deals with global oppression and grinding poverty as like a laugh line.
That's right. There are a lot of laugh lines in this movie that are that kind of like cringe, like haven't aged all that well.
Let me before I turn it to you, let me tell you what the big thing was for me, because there's all that stuff that just feels like, you know what, if we're going to watch 80s and 90s movies, we're just going to have to deal. And I think everything I've talked about now fits into that. But this Fantasia thing, this like not reality thing that felt so weird coming from 2024 was especially bizarre with the mugging scene. So there's one point where Cher gets deserted by Elton in a bad part of town, and she gets mugged at gunpoint. And she has no sort of concern about it. There's no real sort of threat about it. She's really upset that he's going to make her get down on her belly in the parking lot because she's wearing an Alaya dress. And he says, "A what-a?" And it's just a big joke. But he literally has a gun pointed at her head. And, she's making a fuss and being kind of whiny. And he says, "I will totally shoot you in the head." And it's around that time that I think she's on the phone with Josh, and she says the evening turned into a royal mess, sexually harassed, robbed, and it's just a big joke.
I was curious what you thought about, we haven't really talked about Josh much.
No.
So at the end of the movie, she ends up with a guy who is her stepbrother. Mm-hmm. They've not spent a lot of time growing up together, so they don't see each other as brother and sister. That is her stepbrother. And, which I think also tracks, a lot of the Jane Austen era, these people, they are vaguely related to each other. Okay. So she ends up with her stepbrother. Also, there's a considerable age difference, right? So he's in college, and I think she turns 16 over the course of this movie. And so I was curious if, how we feel about ending up with a reasonably older stepbrother, how that struck you.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's in this first category of like, if you're going to watch 80s and 90s movies, you're going to see a lot of this. I mean, I think you're led to believe that he's about 19 or 20 and she's about 16. And clearly the movie makers don't think the age thing is a problem. I think it's exacerbated a little bit because I think that Paul Rudd was 25 and Alicia Silverstone was 17. And they do look different in age.
That's interesting.
So, yeah,
they really do. They really do.
What is your take on that?
That's a big difference. I guess I think the like being a step sibling thing, it doesn't bother me. It's like a little weird that the movie doesn't actually spend a lot of time commenting on it.
Right.
It just kind of moves on from that. It's a little like I mean, it's not really played for laughs that hard. It's just
just there.
Yeah, exactly. I think in most circumstances, and to be clear, I think there's a lot about the Cher-Josh relationship as it unfolds, especially in the last third of the movie, that's really touching. I mean, they know each other really well. You can see her affection for him growing over the course of the film. I think all of that's really nice. Mm-hmm. I think that the age difference in real life would feel bigger than the way they interact on the screen. They really do interact as equals, but I think the high school college relationship in real life would be a more noticeable difference and would rightly be off-putting to many. All right, best relationship quote. I have one I like quite a bit. Now, this is coming from Ty, as she has been, rejected by Elton.
Yeah, you're too good for him. If I'm too good for him, then how come I'm not with him?
And I just think that right there is the essence of the problem.
Interesting.
If you believe in the hierarchy of mate value, then you end up in this fundamental quandary, which is, well, how can I feel better about what has just happened by saying like, oh, actually, I deserve quote unquote better? It's like you end up tying yourself into knots.
Interesting.
As opposed to, I'm not saying you got to be zen about it and just be like, well, I guess we're not compatible. But instead, thinking of yourself as not someone else's cup of tea. I'm not, again, it's still going to hurt. It's still going to feel like rejection, but it's less actually confusing. And I just think Brittany Murphy just nails it there.
She did. She did. She was crying and she did a beautiful job. But you're right. There's something very, very different about saying to ourselves, looks like we weren't a good match versus looks like I'm not as appealing as I thought I was.
That's right. When every rejection is a referendum on your value, this thing sucks.
It's brutal.
You don't, this is one way to look at it.
Yeah.
It's not the only.
Yep.
All right. What do you got?
You know, one thing that I liked is the part where Christian, the gay boy that Cher really likes, who turns out to be not interested in her for reasons that we find out later.
You like Billie Holiday?
I love him.
Right.
And what I like about that is many of our listeners, of course, will be aware that Billie Holiday is a woman. And this is how we end up feeling like similarity is such an important predictor of our attraction.
Yeah, there it is.
Is that when we're really interested in somebody, we just tune ourselves to their frequency. And she's trying to do it. She's just being friendly. And look, it's easy to mock her like, oh, what a fool, how clueless Cher is that, she says, I love him when talking about Billie Holiday. But all of us do this. We calibrate ourselves to the person that we're talking to, especially if we like that person. And then we, lo and behold, discover that we had a lot of stuff in common and stuff that we liked about each other. And one thing that's kind of wild, again, this is something that 15, 20 years ago I wouldn't have known. Actual similarity is a very small predictor of how much we're attracted to people. What's a really big predictor of how attracted we are to people is I feel like we had a lot in common. But of course, Cher thinks that she has a lot in common with Christian because they both love this male named Billie Holiday.
So I have one more quote, and it's kind of a long one, but there are a number of things about it I deeply love.
Wait a second. What am I stressing about? This is like Josh. Okay. So he's kind of a Baldwin. But what would he want with Ty? She could make him happy. Josh needs someone with imagination, someone to take care of him, someone to laugh at his jokes, in case he ever makes any. Then suddenly, oh my God, I love Josh. I am majorly, totally, but crazy in love with Josh.
But what I really love about that quote is at the end, someone to take care of him, someone to laugh at his jokes in case he ever makes any, right? Again, it's like the same like sort of needling affection that the whole movie has. Like she is the kind of making fun of him, but what she sees as his faults, she also finds endearing at the same time. Yeah. And there's also a certain amount of like, I want to care for him. And, to some extent, this is happening in a gendered way, which makes me cringe a little bit. But the reality is that relationships, both sides often work well when people feel, people want to be needed. Mm-hmm. And she is like all of a sudden starting to have this realization. And that's the moment where it happens. And I just kind of think that was a brilliant, it's a funny speech, but it's also secretly a little brilliant.
Yeah, it's interesting. She's an interesting character in this way. And you can understand why Jane Austen felt about Emma the way she did, that she sort of loves this kind of unlovable character because, Emma, of course, but also Cher by extension, narcissistic, conceited, self-indulgent, but also big-hearted, like wanting to do good in the world. And you see right from the very beginning of the movie that Cher is deeply devoted to her father and to taking care of his health. And so that line, that quote that you just shared with us is interesting in the sense that she seems to have like a category of people that she's going to take care of. Yeah. And she just inserted him into that category.
That's a great point.
Yeah. She made a shift and said, that category I have, that little category of people I really would do anything for, is now bigger by one.
Yeah. Yep. It's great.
Yeah.
What do we wish we knew? Either about the science or about what's going on behind the scenes of this movie that would, help us to get more insights here.
One thing that's been on my mind a lot over the last couple of years, especially as COVID hit, is like, what are the circumstances under which an acute stressor or a longer term stressor makes a relationship better versus worse? Like, we have some general sense in relationship science that stress is linked to negative relationship outcomes. Like, we're a little crankier with each other. Things are not great when we're stressed, but those effects aren't as big as I would have anticipated them to be. And I haven't really been able to find much evidence that stress is linked to breakup exactly. And I think that the reason why, and this is sort of analogous to the distinction between post-traumatic stress and post-traumatic growth, right? Aren't there some circumstances under which going through something terrifying together, something upsetting together can bring us closer together? I give this example, of course, because Dion and Murray's highway horror, highway terror brought them together. But the more general question of like, when is it that going through something difficult together breaks us apart versus brings us together? I feel like we don't know as much about that as I wish we did. Yeah.
I wanted to know more about, what is it that makes a good matchmaker? What makes a person a good matchmaker? There's not much research on this. Mm-hmm. There's an old, just a bring back Dave Kenny one more time. He's got a study, it's about 30 years old, where people try to judge unacquainted people, how much they like each other. And people have a lot of confidence that they're doing it pretty well. And they're trying to use similarity to do it. But lo and behold, their judgments are pretty much at chance, right? So people aren't actually good at it, right?
So because if I'm watching two people and I'm like, oh, they really dig each other, I'm basically flipping a coin in that assessment?
Your ability to judge their unique interest in each other, right? So I think that's what he's able to do is how much are you picking up on how much these two people unically like each other, right?
As opposed to like
who's popular, right? I mean, you can see who's popular, right? Yeah. But what Cher's trying to do, Cher's trying to create matches, right? I mean, that's what she does with the two teachers, right? It's like, oh, you two, I bet I can get you to be uniquely interested in each other. And so, okay, people aren't great at doing it from initial acquaintance, but some people in their lives do bring people together and some people don't. And I just want to know more about who are the people that are successful at doing that. Probably extroverts, probably people with large social networks, but I actually don't know if we have a lot of good work on that.
I bet it's like invite people out in groups.
That's I bet you're right. It's that simple. How good is this movie, Eli? Just as a movie, 1 to 5 stars. How do you feel about this movie?
I feel bad saying it out loud. This is a 2-star movie to me.
Oh no! It's devastating. It's devastating.
I'm not into this movie.
All that.
I know that it is well loved. My daughter is crazy about it. Yeah, just didn't really do it for me.
The hater. I give this 4 stars. I think this is a very good movie. I think it's an excellent example of the genre. It is far from perfect. It's got the cringe moments that haven't aged well, but 4 stars I'm going overall.
Well done.
But the real question, of course, is how many Rust Belts you give this movie. Now, the Rust Belt is named after Eli's advisor, the late, great Carol Rust Belt, who's a pioneer of close relationships research, with 5 stars indicating near perfect depiction of the nature of close relationships. So here, I'll go first.
Yep.
I give this movie 3 Rust Belts. It got a lot of things right about attraction. got some things wrong about attraction too. Also, we don't really see anything in the way of what an established relationship looks like, other than what you articulated earlier about her sort of, bringing the people that Cher cares about into her circle. But really, there's not much in here about ongoing relationships. And so I've got a hard cap. I can't go higher than 3 stars, given that it gets some things wrong and given that it doesn't show us anything really about ongoing relationships.
I also gave it 3 rust bolts. I think there's a lot of insight here, and it's a playful way to illustrate some of the ideas. As I mentioned, that scene between Dion and Murray, it's one that I show in class because it's such a good illustration of the misattribution of arousal. So I think there's a lot of stuff that it does well. You and I do have some of the concerns that we've voiced here. So 3 rust bolts for the win.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. That's all we have for today. This is the Love Factually podcast. I'm Paul Eastwick. And Eli, we will see you next time.
I look forward to it. The Love Factually podcast is produced and edited by Paul Eastwick and Eli Finkel, featuring music from Andrew Fraker and Sounds.